Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the day. We are going to be talking, as Rick said, about the legacy of Superstorm Sandy on the grid. So you know GTM as a publisher of news, research, and organizer of events like this one. And now we're a publisher of ebooks, or an ebook. A couple of weeks ago, we did release our first one called Resiliency, How Superstorm Sandy Changed America's Grid. And we wanted to ask what the big regulatory and business changes were after the storm. And I was going to sit up here and give a 45-minute passionate reading of the ebook, but I figured that it wouldn't be as compelling as listening to David Sedaris or Michael Lewis read their books. So, although there are some wonks in this room that might appreciate that, I figured we'd bring up a panel of experts to walk through some of the themes that we outlined in the book. So why are we talking about Sandy 20 months on? The reason was simple, and it was why we put out the book in the first place, because utilities, the regulators, policymakers on the federal and state level, technology providers are still talking about this. And it's important for this crowd as well, because resiliency really isn't a new word in the utility sector. But because of some of the changes that utilities are going through in terms of looking at new customer interactions, the potential or already underway surge in distributed generation, and the big issues that regulators are having to grapple with in terms of potential changes to business models, those are starting to intersect with extreme weather planning, grid modernization, and this broad concept of resiliency. So we attempted to tell the on-the-ground story of how utilities reacted to the storm and what those entities are doing afterward. So joining me up on the stage today is David Wade. He is Executive Vice President of EPB, a utility serving Chattanooga, Tennessee. And they have one of the more progressive smart grid programs that have been implemented and have seen some pretty major successes in terms of managing outages and large extreme weather events. Jessica Lubetsky, who is a policy at with the Clean Energy Program at Pew Charitable Trust, and she's been heavily involved in some of the policy discussions on the federal and state levels around what this resiliency framework is and how you integrate DG in that. And then Rick Nicholson, who is the Senior VP of Transmission and Distribution at Ventix, which is an operational software provider and data analytics company. They serve the utility industry and other heavy industries, and they became an ABB company a few years ago. So, Jessica, let's turn to you and frame this in a broader policy context. In 2009, the president traveled around the country, touting the stimulus package and coming smart grid investments. And he gave a number of speeches talking about the benefit of advanced metering technologies, fault detection, all these IT technologies that the administration was pushing. But very rarely did he talk about resiliency and extreme weather preparedness. We heard a little bit about managing outages, but that was only a small part of messaging. Fast forward to 2011 and 2012, we saw Hurricane Irene, a big derecho, a nor'easter that knocked out power for millions, and then on top of that, Hurricane Sandy. All of a sudden, the administration is talking completely differently and shaping programs around resiliency in the power sector. What is your perception of how that's changed, and what do you think some of the most important changes have been?
That's a great question. And, actually, after reading the ebook, I don't think I realized how striking that difference was. Before the storm hit, we saw a lot of conversation about national security, but it was really about the Department of Defense, and it was about the goals the Department of Defense is doing around clean energy and why they're doing it, and it was a lot of a broad conversation that in the field the Department of Defense needs these technologies, but it wasn't really about here. It wasn't about your home, and it wasn't about power outages in the United States in any way at all, and then the storm hit. And so that change has really vibrated around the country. We've been doing roundtables around the country, talking with folks just like you all about this issue, and it is so abundantly clear that that storm has changed the way folks are thinking about how customers are getting their power, whether you're residential, commercial, industrial, and looking at how to maintain power as a resource to the consumer to ensure that that there are less power outages to maintain that business continuity, to ensure contentment across more residential consumers who tend to be much more outspoken in social media and things like that. I think one of the most striking statistics from Hurricane Sandy was the sheer quantity of dollars that was charged out by insurance companies paying business insurance because of the power outages to those businesses who weren't able to conduct their everyday business and their jobs and what have you. That is just, it's an incredible number to look at when you don't even realize how much power means to companies until something like that happens. It's just, nobody thinks about it.
And you sort of underwent a shift as well, because you were working on a lot on CHP issues, and then all of a sudden CHP is a big story. And we saw a number of hospitals and universities that had the power on, and Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York are all talking about CHP now. How did that pivot take place for you? And and I think we've seen a lot of existing policy programs get fed into this resiliency framework.
It was the day after the storm, hands down. We started seeing press releases from companies like Capstone and other turbine manufacturers and microturbine manufacturers touting how their technologies had stayed online over the course of the storm. And the moment I saw that, it clicked. So we started reaching out to those companies, trying to figure out how we could work together, and then utilizing that message to talk to the White House, to talk to other policymakers, and get folks like the Floridian delegation to realize the connection between these technologies and what they could be doing to ensure resiliency for their own power providers and their customers. In the Northeast, it's sort of a striking differential between the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic and what Florida has done traditionally. Once the power, emergency funds started flowing out of the federal government to the New England Mid-Atlantic area, they immediately were moving towards how do we improve what we had before, as opposed to kind of putting sticks and wires back up with spit and duct tape. When we spoke with folks in Florida, this was a sort of striking concept where they had traditionally kind of taken that money that they get after storms occur along the shores, and instead have been taking that money to really just put the lines up and not build much resiliency into the system. So it's been an interesting evolution to see how the states react differently.
So Rick, one of the really interesting statistics that I found when reading some of the data coming out of Sandy was this analysis that the Associated Press did with Ventyx. And they actually found that average restoration times were faster after Sandy than after all the major hurricanes since 2004, which completely surprised me, because we hear about what a poor job utilities did after Sandy, and it turns out that comparatively to other hurricanes, even when there were the most outages we've ever seen after a hurricane, they did a better job. And one of the things you said to me when we were talking, you said, I think utilities have done a fairly good job given the limitations of some of the technologies they have and the visibility they have on the distribution grid. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things to keep in mind is that, utilities have dealt with storm-caused outages as long as there's been storms and wires strung on poles. So it's not like it's a new concept at all, right? But generally speaking, where the focus in the industry has been is how do we react during the storm event? How do we manage through the event and then shortly thereafter? What I think you started to see after Sandy was two things that happening. One was broadening out that time horizon. So looking at how can you improve planning activities even when there isn't a storm that's being forecast. In other words, how can you run simulations better? How can you say, well, what happens if the next storm that comes along is twice as intense, but has, impacts a different part of the service territory, kind of that aspect of it. Moving then into how can you improve mobilization of all your resources prior, like when you know a storm's coming, but it's not there yet. And then all the way through managing through the event, and then doing the post-analysis, which feeds back into the planning phase. So I think that's one thing that we clearly saw, was broadening that out from just focusing on managing the event to the bigger picture. I think the second thing was relating to technology, and that is that the availability of technology to kind of throw at the problem, both automation technologies or smart grid technologies, which flowed out of the stimulus funding. So the ability to ping smart meters to verify power out, power on, greater sensing on the distribution grid, automated switching, intelligent equipment. But also on the software side, once again, a lot more analytics. Being able to pull in a lot of data from disparate sources and be able to do the analysis and do some of these predictions.
What is your opinion on the legacy of the stimulus package and setting the foundation, the IT foundation, for the next level of distribution grid management?
Well, yeah, it's kind of interesting to me because, when the stimulus funds were dispersed, it really wasn't about resiliency at all. It was demand response, and it was get the smart meters out there so you can do more with them, and there was any number of justifications for that funding. But as you got to the tail end of it, and you started to see the impacts of more severe weather events more frequently, I think even though the initial kind of purpose of the stimulus funds wasn't resiliency, you saw a realization that we can use those investments to support resiliency. So I think it once again it was kind of serendipitous that we had that train had kind of left the station, and we were making those investments, and now we could take advantage of them.
Yeah, and when I talked to folks on the federal level and the DOE, like they said the exact same thing, that they articulated that shift exactly as you did. So. David, let's turn to you. EPB is often held up as a really good example of what happens when you can take technology like advanced metering infrastructure, an advanced fiber optic network, and fault switching technology, and manage outages in a big way. And we were talking before this, and you said the plan was to reduce outages in Chattanooga, reduce outage restoration times, increase outage restoration times by 40%, and you said you're seeing 50% change in outage restoration times. Explain how that's taking place.
We're actually seeing about close to a 60% improvement in reliability, improvement in reliability, I guess I would put it. Everything from reduced outages to rapid response. And basically what we have done is use communication and intelligence and sensing devices, and automated switching to put a level of redundancy that virtually covers our entire distribution network. There is an average of, I think we have 1,200 of the Interrupter switches up there installed on a 3,600 circuit mile network. So, we have a high level of redundancy that is filled with automated switching. I think that the biggest challenge that we've had is not getting the improvements. It is asking ourselves, how do we communicate these improvements to our customers? Because I think that goes back a little bit to what we saw with Sandy. Outages and focus on reliability is not new to the industry. It is, frankly, Sandy probably is a small portion of the outages across our nation for that year, even. Even though it was a huge, very compartmentalized, very centralized area that impacted a lot of folks that hit a tipping point. But there's outages that occur every day across our nation, in all parts of our nation, that impact our customers that don't always get discussed in the level that Sandy did. But one of our questions was, how do you communicate with your customers that you're making these improvements? Because if all they do is take it for granted, is it of any value? Because I think that's one of the issues that we've had for years is, our product is somewhat invisible.
How do you communicate that?
We spent quite a bit of time, really going and telling them what it would look like, how they would know that, what type of things they would see if the automated switches was working, and giving them feedback when we had an event that was restored with the automation or prevented through the automation. We would give them direct feedback to individuals through the media. We would, we're putting together maps now. We're close to releasing a real-time map that's somewhat like the radar map on the Weather Channel, that you can hit a replay and you can replay the past few hours or from the start of a storm, and you can see when outages occurred, what was restored automatically and in a time sequence, and when something was physically, someone drove out there and did the response manually because we found that's really the biggest thing, is get a visible picture in front of someone of what's happening. And when they see a picture that shows that most of their outages were restored through automation, they have a greater appreciation for that automation.
And was your primary driver for that investment in 2008 when you began the program, or 2009, was outage restoration central to that?
It was. Actually, the primary driver was economic development. And outage response and reliability being a big portion of that. We know that, that businesses, as I said earlier, Jessica, businesses suffer huge economic losses if they have power outages. If we can provide them with a more reliable service, then they're more likely to locate in our service area as a different part of the region. So that was one of our big drivers, is how do we do things that help businesses say Chattanooga is a good place to do business in.
Yeah. So how are you thinking about extreme weather these days? Has your outlook changed at all? You look at the data and it's very clear that extreme weather events are increasing, and the frequency and the intensity is increasing, and the vast majority of outages for 50,000 customers or more has come from extreme weather. I think it's like 87%. I mean, it's remarkable. And so, then we've seen more climate data being released over the last few months that shows greater frequency of extreme rain events in the Midwest and the Southeast and in the Northeast, greater frequency of drought and wildfires and extreme heat in the West. Are you thinking differently about extreme weather planning? It's always been a piece of the utility picture, but to me, when I talk to folks, there is a fundamentally new framework that they're looking at.
I think it absolutely is just continuing to get more and more emphasis, more energy around how do you plan, how do you develop for that. I think that's certainly the case with us, is looking at what are the next steps to take the level of service we provide our customers to an increasingly higher level. I think that to us, this ideal of putting in communications and then redundancy and segmenting our system into very small areas. And the one thing I didn't mention earlier, we're about a 1,200 megawatt system, so have redundancy levels at about around a megawatt. A little over a megawatt is where so it kind of creates the ability for us to take that step and then to start looking at, well, then what's the next step in those smaller areas? Can we go in and put different steps? So we're constantly looking at, is the next piece to harden something or to put a different source, another source in that segment. So that's kind of what we're doing, looking in.
Mm-hmm. Rick, when you talk to customers, first of all, what are existing customers seeing in terms of improvement of outage restoration times when using your distribution management platform? And when you sit down with new customers, prospective new utility customers, are they thinking differently about this?
So to the first point, I want to congratulate David and his colleagues at EPB, because 60% improvement in reliability is just, it's great. I mean, you pat on the back for that one. I would say that, you know, when we're talking to our utility customers, it's not uncommon to see 30 to 40% improvement in outage performance overall from, you know, technology investments. So, you know, that's still a pretty significant improvement. And the other thing I want to mention, and that goes back to David's point, and that is this idea of the importance of communications to the customers. If you look at some of the resiliency plans that utilities have submitted to regulators, particularly in the Northeast, many of those, the primary justification for the money that they want to spend is not really about improving the outage restoration times. That's somewhere down on the list. It's improving the ability to estimate restoration times and to communicate that effectively to customers. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's really come through loud and clear. Yep. So I think one of the things that I have seen as a kind of systemic change in these discussions is, you know, yes, continue to focus on improving operational performance, reliability, you know, those kind of standard, well-accepted metrics. But what's floated to the top is that ability to, you know, use, as I said, kind of much more sophisticated analytics and come up with much more accurate and consistent restoration time estimates that can be communicated to all the stakeholders, whether it's the customers, the regulators, the mayors of towns, other emergency responders, at a kind of a micro level. I think that's one of the big changes.
Mm-hmm. Jessica, we'll turn to DG again, and maybe we could talk more specifically about CHP, but some of the other technologies. So we've seen some pretty major funding for CHP programs and microgrid programs in Connecticut and New York, New Jersey. And you know, this is great. People are saying, well, we want to put the policy priority behind this, but when you look down on the utility level, or you look even further up on the federal level when it comes to tax credits, for example, there are all sorts of challenges with developing these systems. You know, there's a 10% tax credit for CHP. There are EPA rules associated with emissions that might make it difficult to develop a plant. There are franchise rights associated with the power lines that might cross the street. You know, there are crazy, potentially large interconnection charges. You know, the list goes on. How big a deal is that for, so we've got these funds set aside, but you know, I'm hearing that the actual development of projects might not be as fast as initially assumed.
That's all very true. You know, from a federal perspective, CHP and waste heat to power are both technologies that are strongly disadvantaged. They don't receive the 30% tax credit that geothermal and solar and wind and hydro are getting, and they have a lot more restrictions on them. That's one of the big issues that we're currently working on and trying to fix those problems, and have made significant progress in making that happen. In the meantime, states are really moving out and putting together funding programs. NYSERDA's put together a great funding program that includes combined heat and power, and in fact, only allows combined heat and power systems to qualify if they have an islanding switch on them. Amazing. It's a no-brainer. You know, these systems should be easily allowed to operate outside of the grid when the grid is down. They should easily be able to feed the grid when the grid needs support. This is simply a no-brainer. And so trying to fix the local barriers and the PUC level regulatory issues needs to happen. And it is happening, but it's a slow process. And you know, and I would say it's a lot of education. I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what these technologies do, even though, you know, from the CHP side, this is not new stuff. I think what's new is how CHP can interact with these new technologies like the smart grids, the smart meters, the overlay of software systems. those controls are new to CHP, and seeing how a technology that's over 100 years old can operate with some of this new stuff is pretty phenomenal. From a microgrid perspective, looking at CHP as sort of the heart and building around that heart so that you've got a base load, but it can go up and down with solar or wind or whatever else you're putting on the grid, it's pretty awesome. And that, I think, is what we've seen in these, especially the New England states, have recognized that and are starting to move ahead on that. Hoboken doing a great project on that exactly.
So one of the things I came across as I was talking to folks is that there is a disparity between how utilities view resiliency and how advocates and some policymakers view resiliency, and even some regulators. So a lot of people say we need more DG, everything from CHP to hybrid diesel generators to solar PV with battery storage backup. There's a range of possibilities. But the utilities themselves look at this more from a grid hardening approach, and I felt like they often separated the DG portion of it from everything from raising substations to burying power lines to getting better fault detection technologies, et cetera. Do you see that disparity in the policy framework in terms of how utilities view resiliency and how a lot of others view this in the landscape of changing DG trends?
100%. I think what it comes down to is how we have always, the traditional model of how we pay for power, and that is going to be turned on its head. I don't think anyone knows how exactly that's going to happen yet, but it's going to happen. And the question is, how is it going to happen? What are the intricacies? What are the services that are going to be provided by a utility versus some other service provider? Who's going to we are continually going to have poles and wires. That's not going away anytime soon. So who's going to manage and maintain that versus who's going to power generate versus who's going to transmit over those lines? And I think all of those various services, coupled with demand response and other efficiency measures, figuring out how all of those pieces work together and what that bill looks like to the customer is the challenge. And because we've been seeing more of that DG come online and more of the ability to manage it all through smart meters, through various types of technologies, we're in a little bit of a conundrum. And from all of our discussions, there is not a single person around any of our tables who have said, "Oh, this is the end of utilities." What they've said is, how are the utilities going to respond to it? How are they going to kind of build their niche within the overall system?
Yeah. And certainly New York is, an outlier in this in terms of putting together the PSC, putting together its Performing Energy Vision Plan and integrating that with some of its resiliency planning. David, how do you think about these issues? How do you separate DG versus some of the more the other distribution management technologies?
Well, I think they're all valid, and each situation requires looking at that particular area, that particular situation. So, what gives the best performance for our customers? To me, it's not as much about is it all one or is it all the other. It's about how do you serve, our customers with the highest level of service, and what is the best solution for that. It could be variable depending on what's the existing infrastructure in a particular area, what is the load curves in that area, what's going on. But I think it really ends up being looking at all of the options and saying what best serves our customers at that place, for the level of service and their needs.
Do you think that that's common throughout the utility sector?
I would hope to say so. I think it really is what we're challenged to do is to give that level of service to our customers and to communicate with them. So, what it takes to do that is going to be huge variations depending on individual situations. But if we focus on that, we'll end up having a good solution in the long run.
Yeah. So, you gave a nuanced answer to that, but let me frame it in a much more stark way. Do you see DG as a resiliency technology?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it is. It is one of the options that works well in some situations. I don't think it is if it is just a totally standalone without internal backups itself, then it certainly has its own risk associated. So I think it is a matter of looking at the whole thing, but it's certainly a viable option.
So, Rick, one of the interesting trends we've seen is this flip among utilities and in terms of how they're adopting technologies. So, the broad ecosystem of smart grid technologies has revolved around distributed energy integration in Europe. And here in the US, a lot of it has to do with outage restoration. And that's starting to change. We're seeing utilities say, now we're looking at distributed resources as Europe once did a few years ago. Do you see that in terms of how you're deploying distribution management systems? What are utilities telling you about the change and how they're viewing DG in that context?
Okay. Well, yeah, as you mentioned, if you look at what the utilities that we see kind of leading the charge in deploying kind of smart grid technologies, both on the information technology and the operational technology side, a lot of that has been in Northern Europe, whether it's been Germany or Sweden or Denmark. And those are countries that, as everybody knows, have already high levels of penetration of renewables on their systems. In Sweden and Denmark, it tends to be more wind. Germany, obviously, solar. So they've been leading the charge, and there's some interesting things that have come out of that I'm now starting to see North American utilities show a greater degree of interest in. One of those is that just at a high level, when you integrate renewables, high penetration renewables into particularly a distribution system, as opposed to the high voltage at the transmission level, the complexity of managing that distribution network goes up quite dramatically. And distribution networks still, even after stimulus funding, are not as highly automated as transmission. So the amount of visibility that somebody that's in a control center has into what's happening on that network is still somewhat limited. So finding ways to kind of take that complexity out or deal with the complexity in a more effective manner, a less reactive manner, more kind of proactive manner is probably one of the biggest things that we're seeing right now as far as level of interest that would enable greater deployment of distributed generation. It's really kind of making the control center operator's job less complex. Mm-hmm. Can you say, oh, well, let's do a better job of looking ahead and finding out where we're going to see congestion on the network, based on our forecasts. And we've done that in transmission for a long time. You do your operational planning, you run your state estimation, you look at contingency analysis, and you focus on the areas that you've got potential problems. Well, now we're starting to see that kind of look-ahead capability being applied in distribution, which then kind of comes back around and enables you to deal with these higher levels of penetration of DG.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I'd love to get some questions if there are any. Yes, right here. Let's wait for the mic real quick for the webcast.
Hi, you talked about some of the benefits for Northeast states, but I wonder if you could comment perhaps for California. Are there special initiatives there, programs either by the utilities or the state that help support the installation of CHP or emergency generation?
Do you want to take that, Jessica?
I will try. I don't know as much about California, but I do know that that CARB is certainly looking at CHP, and there are discussions happening about how CHP and other renewables are integrated, and there's discussion on how CHP is sort of counted within that. That's sort of the extent of my understanding of it, but it's certainly something that's being looked at. I think part of the challenge in California is that obviously, unlike renewables, CHP does have an emission. Being that it's run generally from a natural gas or similar sort of fuel, and so I think there's some discussion about how efficiency from that should be considered. when adding up all of these different technologies together to meet the various state goals.
Yeah, in Chattanooga, I'm wondering whether or not you've been reconstructing past storm restoration efforts on that weather map that you were talking about as a way of being able to show before and after with smart grid, before smart grid and after smart grid, as a way to communicate to customers the value.
Yes, we absolutely have been going back and reconstructing those. That's where we've been doing in the past, is reconstructing storms, and we hope to prove that and have that a real-time model out in the next month or so. And so it won't only be a past look, it'll be a future look at what's happening real time.
There was a hand up back there first, but yeah, that hand.
Hi, Arthur O'Donnell, California Public Utilities Commission. Although I work in California and concerned with California, I was raised in New Jersey. And so when the Superstorm hit, I was very concerned about friends and family. There were two things that stood out to me that I consider barriers towards resiliency, and I'll just briefly explain them. One was in my hometown, a brand new peaking power plant had been built and energized just 6 months before, but it was built to serve the Bronx through an underwater cable across the Hudson River. That plant was available, but it had no interconnection to the New Jersey system. And so my hometown was without power for 5 days, even though there was an available power plant there. That was one thing. The second is that after California, New Jersey has the highest level of PV penetration, and yet after the storm, this is something Jessica alluded to, virtually every single one of those units had to shut down for the duration, except for my high school, which had a 2-megawatt unit with an inverter that allowed it to island, right? So to me, in the aftermath, it's not just technology, but it is policies and practices that we have to really look at again. So can you talk about other things, or perhaps these kinds of instances where action could be taken with the specific intent that, you know, once the stuff hits the fan, our usual ways of doing things really ought to be done differently?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So I can't speak eloquently about the peaker plant that you talked about, but in sitting down with folks in New Jersey and talking to like JCP&L and PSE&G, you know, they had a lot of solar customers, particularly PSE&G, who didn't realize that their solar systems would trip offline during the storm. And you know, I talked to Ralph Izzo for a while, who's very supportive of solar, but that goes back to my question earlier, which is how utilities view DG differently in a resiliency framework, because he said, well, I think it's a mistake to see solar and battery backups as a resiliency technology. He went back to concerns about net metering and equity on the grid, and you know, it went back to the real battles and concerns that we're seeing associated with the cost of solar and the cost to manage the grid when solar owners are using it as backup. So I saw a very distinct view of solar, according to Izzo, as not a resiliency technology. And my sense was that a lot of utilities were feeling that same way. So the sentiment is there from a lot of folks in the development community and the advocacy community, but I can't quite say that it was there among many of the utilities I talked to. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I think that the number one thing that can change that perspective and fix some of the problems you've addressed is to find a way to monetize resiliency. There's no financial benefit to a company who puts in a CHP plant and has an islanding switch. They get nothing. They pay extra money for an islanding switch and they get no financial benefit but for that storm that comes through or the grid issue that happens and they get to use their switch. Otherwise, there's no financial benefit. So trying to figure out how to create a market or, you know, one thought I've heard is to have some sort of insurance benefit, so at least you're getting something, your rates go down, I don't know. But until there's some sort of valuation for having backup and resiliency, and whether that's in the form of storage or it's solar that can go online, and be islanded, or whatever the thing is, there is no incentive to do this.
You know, I would just point out, back to Arthur's comment about the peaking power plant. If it's a utility-owned asset, like a peaking plant, that there is a recovery mechanism. And what I'm starting to see is that both the utilities and the regulators are starting to think in that direction. In other words, if you're going to put in a new asset, think about how that relates to resiliency as well as whatever the other reason is, and then consider, can we put that additional interconnection for resiliency into the rate base that we might not have done previously. So I think that there is a shift in thinking that's starting to happen.
There's also been a little bit of a review of what is needed in an emergency disaster situation, which had not occurred before the storm. So, looking at where people migrated to in, potentially the week or more that they may have been out of power, where did they go to get power? Libraries were never really seen previously as a place of refuge, but because in order to fill out any FEMA paperwork you needed a computer, libraries became a place of refuge. They had power, they had a place you could plug in your cell phone. So there have been drastic differences since those plans were made that are starting to come around in full circle to see where do you now need to put power that you didn't necessarily need to put power before. So it's not just schools, it's not just hospitals and assisted living facilities, but it's a broader audience. There's also been an enormous amount of studies now done on the statistics of what happens when you move people who are on life support. We didn't really know before, and let me just say, you don't want to be on life support when the power goes out. Bad things happen. So, looking at all of that, and then also the financial benefit to just hospitals across the state. There was a study in Massachusetts looking at I think it was something like $800 million saved per year if all the hospitals were to get CHP systems for backup. Even through the healthcare acts, the Health and Human Services has put together a notice of proposed rulemaking to look at power backup for a wide variety of medical facilities. So all of this is happening because of the storm. And frankly, before, especially from an emergency health perspective, energy was not on the forefront of folks' minds. When we've met with the health facility folks, energy hadn't even occurred to them in many ways until these storms happened, and they realized, wow, this is a serious problem. And it really wasn't until Katrina and then Irene and Hurricane Sandy where that really sort of came together.
Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to get a regulator on this panel to talk about how they're thinking about valuing resiliency as well, and we had some conflicts. But I'll wrap up because we just have a minute and a half left here. Very briefly, do you have an opinion on the specific legacy of Sandy as it relates to your business or your work? What do you think the biggest legacy of that storm and extreme weather planning will be?
I guess from our perspective, it gets back to what I said initially, and that is that it's no longer utilities coming to Ventyx and issuing an RFP for an outage management system, which was kind of the norm previously. It's taking that holistic look at the end-to-end process and looking broadly at what's the full portfolio of technology investments that they can make that take them from early stage planning right through the event to post analysis and kind of closing the loop.
Jessica?
I would say it's been a uniting factor for congressional members. Whether you're conservative or liberal or whatever you are on that spectrum, if your state was affected, you heard from your constituents, and resiliency has been definitely a message point that has gotten some folks on some of our bills that would never have really thought much about it before.
Amazing how disasters can unite people around money. And David, what about you?
I would agree, but with Jessica and Rick is it has caused us to take a broader look and to more consolidate thoughts and really to place I think the big key though is it's allowed a broader group of our nation to understand how valuable resiliency and how valuable having power and energy is, and willing to make investments in that thing. I think that'll be the legacy, is the investments that it comes out of it, regardless of what those investments are.
Cool. All right, great. You can read the ebook at greentechmedia.com, and I want to thank David Wade, Jessica Lubetsky, and Rick Nicholson. Let's give them a hand. Thanks.